Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to turn that pile of scientific reading into something clear, something useful. And you asked for it, a deep dive into a major scientific report that's, well, right at the crossroads of ecology, economics, and national policy.
So that's exactly what we're tackling today. We're looking at the American Fisheries Society Special Report. Headwater streams and wetlands are critical for sustaining fish, fisheries, and ecosystem services. This was a really big synthesis effort. The lead author was Susan A.R. Colvin, but there was a huge team involved. It's kind of a scientific statement about the waters we often, overlook.
Yeah, and it's really important for you to understand how they built their case here. This wasn't about new field studies. It's a systematic review. They basically pulled together this massive body of existing peer-reviewed science. A lot of it, actually over 1,200 studies, was initially gathered for the 2015 Waters of the United States rule, the WODS rule. Their goal here was pretty clear. Show, with solid evidence, that critical link between the really small, sometimes not even year-round, water bodies and the entire downstream river system. Okay, let's unpack that right away. What exactly are we talking about with headwaters, in this specific context, and why is this such a hot topic nationally right now?
Right. So headwaters are essentially the starting points. They're the parts of a river basin that feed into the downstream waters. The big rivers, lakes, eventually the ocean. And the definition they use is broad, which is key. It includes those small tributary streams. Some flow all year, permanent ones. Others only flow seasonally or, just now and then, intermittent. And even ones that only flow right after rain, the ephemeral streams. Plus, crucially, it also includes those wetlands that might seem isolated, the ones outside of typical floodplains. And the scale here, that's really why it's so urgent. Get this, if you look at all the river and stream length in the lower 48 states, headwater streams make up something like 79% of the total length. 79%.
Yeah.
And they drain over 70% of the land area. This isn't some minor detail. It's literally the bulk of our country's stream network.
Wow, wait, did you say 79%? Of the
79%, yeah.
That completely changes the picture I have in my head of our national water system. If the big rivers are the main arteries, are you saying headwaters are like the capillaries, the tiny vital bits we don't always see?
That's a great analogy, exactly. And that's this concept of connectivity. The paper really hammers home. It's about the physical, chemical, and biological links, moving stuff, water, sediment, nutrients, life from the smallest, highest points all the way down. The core message is these headwater systems have a profound effect on how everything works downstream, including fisheries, not just locally, but way down in the big rivers, lakes, even coastal areas.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense for things like water flow, maybe sediment. But what about the chemistry? Can you give an example? How does a tiny stream, one that might even dry up sometimes, do a better job at some essential chemical function than a big river?
Yeah, the water quality aspect is fascinating. Nutrient cycling, especially nitrogen removal. The authors found that the fastest uptake and transformation of inorganic nitrogen, the stuff that can cause pollution problems downstream, happens in the smallest streams, and particularly in those temporary streams.
Temporary streams. Why them? Why would they be the star players in cleaning up nutrients?
It seems to be about the contact. In these really small or temporary streams, there's a much higher ratio of water interacting directly with the stream sediment. So the water spends more time basically in close contact with the microbes and the physical structure of the stream. That allows for really rapid nutrient uptake and processes like denitrification, which turns polluting nitrogen into harmless nitrogen gas. The paper points out that in some areas, these headwater tributaries could be responsible for removing up to maybe 45% of the nitrogen flowing downstream. Without that initial cleanup right at the source, the downstream pollution load would be way, way worse.
And when you try to put a price tag on that free service nature is providing, the numbers in this report are just astronomical.
They really are staggering. The estimated value they cite for ecosystem services, flood control, nutrient cycling, clean water from these headwaters and related systems, is $15.7 trillion per year. That's just for the headwaters in the continental U.S. and Hawaii, plus another, $673 billion a year for those non-floodplain wetlands.
Hold on, 15.7 trillion. That number is almost too big to grasp. How does that stack up against, say, the entire U.S. economy?
Well, the entire U.S. gross domestic product is roughly in that same ballpark, maybe a bit higher depending on the year.
So we're talking about nature providing services basically equivalent in value to the entire output of the U.S. economy every year for free.
That's the implication of these estimates, yeah. It really highlights the scale of what's potentially at stake if these systems lose protection, especially considering they make up that 79% of stream miles.
Okay, that covers the chemistry and the economics, which is huge. But let's shift focus. What about life itself? What unique role do these smaller, maybe drier systems play for the fish? They can't just be plumbing, right?
Oh, absolutely not. They're critical habitat, and maybe even more importantly, they act as refuge. Think about really vulnerable species, desert fishes, for example, like pupfish. Sometimes their entire world, their whole species range, might be just one tiny, isolated spring-fed headwater. Or you have federally listed species like cavefish. Their survival depends entirely on the health of intermittent streams feeding into cave systems or sinkholes in karst landscapes. If those specific headwaters get damaged, the species could be gone instantly. There's often no alternative habitat downstream. And beyond that, they're also vital refuges from, well, all sorts of things. Invasive species that might dominate larger rivers, extreme floods or droughts, and especially thermal stress. As waters warm with climate change, these cooler headwaters can be essential cool water sanctuaries.
Right, refuge makes sense. But the finding about migratory fish really caught my eye. It's not just about protecting the rare little guys. These small systems are actually fueling some of our big commercial fisheries downstream.
Exactly. That long-nosed sucker example is perfect. These fish swim out of massive lakes like Lake Michigan and migrate up into these relatively small tributaries just to spawn. Then, the millions and millions of tiny larval suckers drift back downstream into the lake. And what happens then? They become a massive food source, a huge nutritional boost for the fish people actually want to catch, like walleye and salmon. It's this incredible energy transfer from a small stream fueling a huge lake fishery.
And then there was that finding that seems completely backwards at first glance, the one about coho salmon smolts. The fish that grow up in temporary streams are bigger?
Yeah, it's a really striking finding about recruitment, about making the next generation juvenile coho salmon, the young ones called smolts, that live in these complex pools within intermittent headwater streams, streams that partially dry up in Oregon.
Hmm.
They found these smolts were often significantly larger than the ones raised in nearby streams that flowed year-round, the perennial ones.
Wouldn't less water be more stressful? Why would a stream that sometimes dries up produce a bigger, presumably healthier fish than one with constant flow? What's going on there?
It's likely not just one thing, probably a combination of factors. It could be about habitat complexity and maybe less competition. As the flow reduces, these deep pools can become isolated. They might stay cooler, offer better protection from larger predators that can't access them easily. It might concentrate food resources in those pools too. So less energy spent fighting currents, good food, good cover. And the kicker is, larger smolts have a much, much higher survival rate once they reach the ocean. So these intermittent streams, the ones that seem less reliable, are actually critical for producing the fish that successfully survive and return to sustain the population. They're vital for recruitment.
So the economic stakes, the cultural stakes, they're clearly astronomical. We mentioned the $15.7 trillion in services, but let's focus just on the fishing industry itself.
Yeah, the connection is direct and the stakes are huge. Commercial and recreational fishing combined contributed something like over $208 billion in economic impact back in 2015 in the U.S. And a massive chunk of that depends directly on having cold, clean headwaters. Think about trout fishing. Nationally, trout anglers spend about $3.5 billion supporting what they estimate is a $10 billion total economic impact. That relies almost entirely on healthy headwater streams. Or look at the huge wild salmon fishery in Bristol Bay, Alaska, that generates $1.5 billion every year. Those salmon need pristine headwaters to spawn. And you see the fragility instantly when something goes wrong upstream. The paper brings up the Gold King mine spill in 2015. Remember that. 3 million gallons of toxic mine waste poured into a headwater stream in Colorado. The damage to that one headwater immediately shut down valuable downstream trout fisheries for a whole summer. It shows how impairing the source translates directly to economic loss.
Right, but it's not just about dollars and cents, is it? The paper really emphasizes what these waters mean culturally, particularly for Native peoples.
Absolutely. That's a foundational part of the report's argument. For many tribes, especially in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, salmon aren't just food. They're essential to identity, to tradition, to spirituality. The Nez Perce tribe, for example, see their own survival as deeply intertwined with the survival of the salmon. You just can't separate their cultural history and future from the health of those headwater spawning grounds. And this connection shows up in conservation too. Think about efforts to restore species like alewives in Maine. These fish swim way up into headwaters to spawn. The Passamaquoddy tribe is actively involved, using their traditional ecological knowledge tech, basically generations of observation and understanding, to help guide those recovery efforts. It shows this deep living connection between people, water, and conservation that continues today.
Okay, so we've laid out the value, ecological, economic, cultural, but now we hit the policy dimension, right? This science runs straight into the ongoing legal arguments about the Clean Water Act, and specifically the definition of waters of the United States, or WOTS.
That's really the crux of why this report was compiled and published when it was. The Clean Water Act's goal, way back when, was pretty holistic: restore and maintain the integrity, chemical, physical, biological, of the nation's waters. But which waters exactly count as waters of the United States under federal jurisdiction got really confusing after a Supreme Court case in 2006, Rapanos v. United States. The court was split, basically leaving us with two competing ideas about which waters get federal protection.
Right, the split decision. Can you remind us what those two competing legal standards were?
Sure. On one hand, you had Justice Scalia's interpretation. It was quite narrow. He basically argued that federal protection should only apply to waters with relatively permanent flow, like year-round streams, or those with a continuous surface connection to navigable waters. If you strictly apply that definition, you immediately leave out most of those intermittent and ephemeral streams we've been talking about, the 79% of the network, and many wetlands, too. Then, on the other hand, you had Justice Kennedy's view. His was broader and really hinged on the science of connection. He proposed what's called the significant nexus test. This means even non-navigable waters, like those headwater streams or wetlands, should be protected if science shows they significantly affect the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the larger downstream navigable waters.
Okay, so this Colvin report, the one we're discussing, essentially provides a massive body of scientific evidence supporting that significant nexus idea, supporting Kennedy's approach. And it explicitly warns that if you go with a narrower rule, like Scalia's definition based on permanence, you'd end up stripping protections from potentially thousands upon thousands of miles of headwater streams and, what was it, 6.59 million hectares of wetlands outside floodplains.
Exactly. And even that number might be lowballing it. The authors point to a real problem with mapping. They cite studies showing, for instance, that in the western U.S., about 33% of the stream length currently mapped as a perennial, meaning flowing year-round, was actually found on the ground to be non-perennial or maybe not even a stream at all. So if a new rule relies heavily on flow permanence using current maps, the actual amount of critical habitat losing protection could be much larger than estimated because the maps themselves aren't accurate enough to capture the reality of these temporary but vital systems.
So wrapping this up, the authors don't actually tell policymakers exactly what rule to write. Instead, they end with a more constructive recommendation.
Precisely. It's an appeal to process, really. They strongly urge the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to conduct a formal, thorough, ecological and economic risk assessment. Basically, quantify scientifically what the potential negative impacts, ecological, economic, cultural, would be if the scope of WSQS protection is narrowed. They argue that any policy decision about the nation's waters needs to be fully informed by the demonstrated value of those trillions of dollars in services, the fishery support, the cultural significance of these critical headwater ecosystems.
It really brings us back to that first number, doesn't it? That 79%. Given that nearly 4/5 of our entire stream network depends on these intermittent and ephemeral flows of waters that aren't always there, not always visible, it leaves you wondering, what hidden ecological memory, what vital functions are we risking if we decide to only protect the waters we can consistently see flowing year-round? It really challenges us to think about connection even when the water itself isn't immediately obvious.